Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good. Excellent. Buenos días.
Good morning.
Bon dia. Okay, thank you. That was for Raisa. Thank you for those of you that actually got here at 8:30 in the morning. We appreciate that. We are not starting exactly on time. We're trying to start as close to on time as possible in honor of you. We know others will join us as we go closer to the 9 o'clock hour. We are extremely pleased to have an extraordinary group of speakers today talking about one of the most important things going on in this hemisphere. And I know there are lots of things that can compete for that attention, but I think all of you know here in this room and those that are following us on the webcast that the migration flows in this region are truly extraordinary compared to the past. There have always been migration flows within Latin America and the Caribbean. There have been intra-regional migration flows, but they've tended to be smaller. Much of the migration flows have been outside towards other countries, towards North America and towards Europe. But in the past 5 years, we've seen an enormous increase in migration flows within Latin America and the Caribbean. And we have an extraordinary group of speakers who are going to talk about that today, including a number of people. Our first panel are people from the region who will be talking about this, government and civil society. Our second panel will deal specifically with Nicaragua. I'll come to that in a second. Nicaraguan flows to Costa Rica. And then we have people from international organizations. The largest flow by far, as everyone here knows, is of Venezuelans. Officially, about 4.5 million Venezuelans have left their country in recent years, about 2/3 of them in the past 2 years alone, overwhelmingly going to other countries within the region, and in numbers that are quite extraordinary. I mean, 1.5 million, give or take, in Colombia, probably over 1 million. The official figures are a little lower, but probably over 1 million in Peru, probably officially 330,000 in Ecuador, but probably much higher, around that number, over 300,000 in Chile, but probably much higher. Brazil, Argentina. I mean, these are numbers that are significant. Almost every country in Latin America and the Caribbean has received a significant number of Venezuelan migrants in the past 2 years, except for the countries that are net senders of migrants, like Haiti and Honduras and others. Almost every other country in the region has been touched by the Venezuelan migration flow. We like to say in the long term, this is going to be good for Latin America and the Caribbean. I mean, almost certainly this is an injection of innovation, entrepreneurship, and people who have a desire to make their lives better. Immigration in the long term tends to be very beneficial. But in the short term, there's no question that it's creating enormous strains on a number of countries in the region. It's countries that already had services, education services, health services, housing, that were in short supply, that were strained, are trying to deal with additional population in very short periods of time. Overall, you don't hear more about this crisis, and I know those of you in this room and those of us on the webcast know about this, but you don't hear more in the press around the world, in part because countries in the region have actually been fairly good at receiving migrants from Venezuela, right? They're overall, and we'll hear about this, countries have been innovative in terms of how they deal with refugee status, in the case of Mexico and Brazil in some cases, but also other pathways to legal status, opening up classrooms, opening up at least emergency health care services, and overall populations have been receptive. We now start to see some pushback in some countries, and I'm sure we'll hear about that. But overall, the reception has been fairly positive. That said, it is still a major crisis, almost paralleling in terms of numbers the crisis in Syria. And in Venezuela, I should say, I mean, we're dealing with both people who are directly politically persecuted, but we're also dealing with a state that has essentially collapsed. And I just wanted to, this is our bolivares, no? This is Venezuelan money. You can buy this on the street of Bogota now, right? It is actually worth more to people who have fled Venezuela to sell their currency than to try and change it for Colombian pesos, because it's worth nothing. If you want sort of a visual of a collapse of a state, it is the fact that people, if you go any place where there are large numbers of Venezuelans, you will see the money changers who take literally large bunches of billetes of the currency and hand out a few coins in return, right? I mean, this is a state in collapse, something we've seen very few times in the Americas. We've seen many other times in other places in the world. My colleague Kathleen Newland knows a great deal about this. We've seen other states that have collapsed, but this is somewhat new in Latin America. It is not, however, the only crisis, and we will be talking today not only about Venezuela, but also the Nicaraguan crisis. Nicaragua has many of the same traits as Venezuela, on a smaller scale, of course, but it is a country that, since April 2018, has entered into a spiral of violence and political persecution as a group of citizens began to protest the government. You have seen since a huge retrocession of the economy in Nicaragua, not on the scale of Venezuela, but on a significant scale, to the point that there has been a large outflow, primarily to Costa Rica, of anywhere from 80,000 to 100,000 Nicaraguans. Say that it's much smaller than the Venezuelan crisis, but as we'll hear later, I see Manuel Orozco sitting over here. We'll see, I mean, that's about 2% of Costa Rica's population. It's about 2% of Nicaragua's population moving to Costa Rica and adding another 2% of the population. So it is comparable in scale, even though it's much more focalized than the Venezuelan flow. And it gets even less attention. And so we want to really highlight that today. Our second panel will focus on Costa Rica and Nicaragua because it is another area that simply has passed unnoticed, but is actually putting enormous strains on Costa Rica, but where Costa Rica has also tried to go out of its way to be receptive. We're very pleased to have an extraordinary panel today. Roxana, buenos días. And so I am going to, before I introduce them to you, let me say you can actually tweet questions to us today, especially those of you who are on the webcast. If you're in the room, just raise your hand when we get to questions and answers. It's easier than tweeting at us. But if you are outside the room watching this on the webcast, tweet at us at Migration Policy, or if you want to tweet about the event itself, this is a public event, at Migration Policy. You can also use the hashtag MPI Discuss, or you can email questions to events@migrationpolicy.org. We're very pleased to have with us today an extraordinary panel, as I said earlier. I mean, really extraordinary panel. Thank you for making the effort to travel from afar to be here. This group, all of you have actually traveled from afar. We have one panelist who I'll introduce in a second who is joining us by video conference because of cuestiones de fuerza mayores, they say in Spanish, for overriding reasons. Roxana del Águila Tuesta. I'm going to give you very brief. You have here the bios on your seat, so I'm going to do very brief bios, but you have everyone's full bio here. Roxana del Águila, Frieda Roxana del Águila Tuesta, Dr. del Águila, is the director, the superintendent of Migration Peru. She is the one, among other things, she has a long career in public service as well as doctorates in law and philosophy. But among other things was the person who developed, as she will talk about, Peru's PTP, the temporary permit that has allowed Venezuelans to stay and integrate themselves into Peruvian society, and has been immensely creative in dealing with migration policies. We are very pleased to have Krüger Sarmiento. Christian, I believe, is joining us by video. Hello, Christian. Christian, is it your birthday also? Happy birthday. Yes, we have Christian with us. He's not here because of his birthday. He is not here because in Colombia there were elections on Sunday and he was asked to do some measures at the border for which he had to stay in Colombia. But we're very pleased you can join us today, Christian. Colombia is the country not only that has the largest Venezuelan population, and we should say, well, there are 4.5 million Venezuelans outside their country. The numbers are probably much larger than this in reality, right? So Colombia.
Muchas gracias, Andrew.
Hola, Cristian. ¿Cómo
Gracias.
estás? Feliz cumpleaños, ¿eh?
Muchas gracias, muchas gracias. Un saludo para todos.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure.
If you don't speak either Spanish or English, please get a headset outside and join us in the translation. Colombia not only has officially 1.4 million Venezuelans that most have arrived in the past 2 years, but also a huge pendular population of people who move back and forth across the border, as well as most people on their way to Ecuador, Peru, and Chile are going through Colombia. So there is a very large, Colombia has a very direct interaction and has also, under Christian's leadership, and some of you saw Felipe Muñoz here a few weeks ago, they have really had a massive response of trying to legalize people, trying to make sure they have access to basic services for those that stay in Colombia. Andrés Ramírez, good to have you here, Andrés. Great pleasure to have you here, is director of Mexico's asylum system, COMAR. He has a long career at the UNHCR, including you came out and were the regional director at the end for Central America, Latin America, towards the end of your career, but has served all over the world, including coordinating the response to the Rwanda crisis at the Tanzania-Rwanda border for UNHCR, and incredibly pleased to have you here. Mexico has been very innovative in its refugee response to Venezuelan migrants. Hernán Yánez González is the subsecretario, the undersecretary for protection of migrants and attention to migrants in Ecuador's foreign ministry, which is called Foreign Ministry and Ministry of Human Mobility. They have both the task of traditional foreign relations, but also what Ecuador has talked about as human mobility, what others would talk about as migration. He has a long career in the Ecuadorian Foreign Service, most recently served in Venezuela, actually, and served as head of the cooperation arm of Ecuador's foreign ministry. José Tomás Vicuña. José Tomás, great to have you here. He is... I would say you're not wearing jeans, but kind of wearing jeans. José Tomás is is a Jesuit priest. Actually, as you see him, he is a Jesuit priest, but he is the head of Chile's Jesuit Migration Service. He is an outstanding voice in Chile. He is someone who, on migration issues, has been, I would say, the leading voice in civil society, but also has the ear of people in the policy community. And though our subject today is not as what is going on in Chile, I'm sure we'll touch on that, in some ways has also become a very important mediator in some of the discussions going on around the protests in Chile right now. And great to have you here. And we've been together on a number of occasions through the years now. Raiza Ortiz Cetra. Raiza, great to have you here for the first time, actually. Raiza is with CELS. CELS is an outstanding organization in Argentina, which works on a number of issues, human rights and legal legal organization. But she particularly has been following both the Global Compact and legalization programs around Latin America. She's originally Brazilian, but has been in Argentina for a number of years. And we're going to ask you to speak a bit about Argentina, but also since you've been looking across Latin America as well. Let me also recognize here in the front row Jessica Bolter, Diego Chavez, and Andrea Tanco, who've been part of putting this event together, as well as Lisa Dixon and Michelle Middlestat back there. So thank you. And with that, we're going to start the conference. And now we filled up the room, so... anyone wondered why I was talking so long? This is why. Welcome, everybody. Let's start with Roxana. Roxana, you did the first regularization program. You have probably over 1 million Venezuelans who've arrived in Peru. Peru was not a country that had a lot of recent experience with migration. There'd always certainly been migration in Peru. I mean, it is a country that has had Asian and European migration for many years, but this scale and this speed of migration. How is Peru dealing? ¿Cómo va Perú con la cuestión de la migración?
How is Peru doing in terms of migration, and what kind of actions is the Peruvian government taking in order to face this huge migration flow? We're going to be speaking both languages. Some will speak Spanish and some will speak English, but now we're going to switch to Spanish. So. Okay, as I was saying, this is the first experience Peru has had in terms of migration flows. We began with a rule that was called PTP, which is the temporary stay permit. So in order to regulate the situation of Venezuelans in our country as tourists, we began with 8,000. Now we have 80,700. Out of them, most of them have this temporary stay permit, which enables to, in addition to access to work, education, and eventually health services. This rule is good for a year when we're dealing with temporary stays, and then we deal with a special foreign ID where Venezuelan citizens become residents. However, we have sought other mechanisms. Currently, because of the humanitarian visa, there's been a reduction because of security issues, because there's been a significant increase in crime in our country. And we believe that this is a result of targeted actions aimed at stabilizing the Peruvian society. So not just Peruvians, but also foreigners that are in our country, which obviously resulted in assessing everybody in our country. And we believe that between 20 and 45-year-olds, about 40% are professionals, and about 3,600 are physicians, 22,000 professors, 32,000 engineers. So this is a positive type of migration. So our next step would be to orderly and safely incorporate them in our society. Excellent. So you continue to work in trying to regularize the situation. So the next step would be how to take this highly skilled human capital and merge it in the Peruvian society. Now, Christian, you are in the hotbed. You're right next to Venezuela. You have received a large number of Venezuelans in Colombia, but you also get a lot of Venezuelans that transit through Colombia on their way to other countries. There's a very active pendular migration. So how are you dealing with that in Colombia? Okay, well, good morning, Andrew, again to you and to all of you that are following this video conference. Greetings to Roxana, whom I work with very closely on an ongoing basis. And as I was saying, we have 4 types of migrations. Sometimes in the case of Venezuela, we just remember those who stay in our country, but we have 4 types. The first one is the destination migration. Colombia has received more than 1.2 million Venezuelans in our country. We are the country, by the way, that has received the largest number of migrants from Venezuela. Over a third of them have come to Colombia. On average, we receive 2,000 Venezuelans daily in our country. This is a significant number. In addition to that, we get a lot of transit migration because of the lack of resources to buy air tickets or lack of passports because, you're familiar with this. So they tend to go through Colombia on their way to other destinations. And an important characteristic of this transit migration is that this happens towards the south. For the time being, this does not happen to the center of the continent or to the north, but rather to the south of the continent, precisely because of their lack of passport and the jungle area that they need to cross to get to the center part of the continent. We also have a return migration. Let us remember that Colombia has gone through a 180-degree change. We went from being a country that exported, quote-unquote, migrants to other countries to, quote-unquote, import migrants. We have a population of about 50 million. In 2014, we had maximum 130,000 foreigners residing in a country, including Venezuelans. Now we have over 1.5 million Venezuelans only. And the migration that makes us special and unique is this pendular migration. We have over 4 registered Venezuelan migrants that come to Colombia, buy some products, and go back to the country. They go to Colombia to get services. Over 380 billion pesos is what Colombia has invested in health services, and that will be about $120 million. Over 1.5 million vaccines that were administered to Venezuelan migrants, and this is the population that is increasing the most, and it's worth mentioning as well, because a lot of the Venezuelans that went to other destination countries are now coming back to the border area on the Venezuelan side. Why are they returning? Because it's not a paradise. They're being exploited. They live in very precarious conditions, and so they are forced to going back to the countries, but not to their original citizens' towns in Venezuela, but rather along the border. They cross over to Colombia. They study. We have over 190,000 Venezuelans that study in Colombia, get service in Colombia, and go back to Venezuela. And they say, I'd rather have it hard in Venezuela, but at least see my family once in a while. So this is the type of migration that is also worth mentioning. And then return migration, finally. Venezuelans that left 2-3 decades ago are coming back, and that's about 500,000 of them. So this is a big challenge. Our national policy, just to be brief in my comments, is to try to be flexible. Colombia, for example, in the region receives this migration that migrates out of need. So rather than imposing restrictions on this population, we want to be more flexible, because the harsher the measures are, the more irregular migration becomes, and that turns into violence or damaging education or health services. So we try to be flexible, because what do we see in this entire process? The only way out we see is to assimilate these people in the countries or territories that they choose as a destination. Because unless we do it that way, migration is going to occur anyways, but in a much more complex situation, both for the receiving communities as well as for the migrants themselves. So again, our government has been flexible and generous. We will continue to be generous, but of course we hope that the other countries in the region apply the same concepts or go by the same principles as Colombia. Thank you. Thank you, Christian. Every time I speak with people from Colombia, from the national government, but also from national governments or Congress in Colombia, is that everybody says that migration will benefit the countries in the long term. Even though in the short term adjustments must be made, in the long term it will be highly positive. And this has been a huge achievement in Colombia, to reach consensus. That doesn't mean that the entire Colombian society has reached consensus on this area, but we'll talk in a minute about how society is responding to this. But the government, in all of its areas, there's an overall consensus that we need to accept that in the long term this migration will be beneficial, but in the short term that will imply incurring additional costs. Hernán, can you talk a little bit about Ecuador? You're undergoing a very interesting process where on the one hand you have included some new requirements for visas for Venezuelans, but at the same time you're trying to regularize tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans in your country. So how has the immigration policy changed in Ecuador? Thank you, Andrew. I wanted to say that Ecuador, with the constitution in 2008, started saying that it's a country that is fully open to migration. Our Constitution acknowledges human mobility and universal mobility, but of the past few years we have had to be a little bit more pragmatic to face this migration crisis. Currently there are 24 countries that require visas to get into Ecuador, which is a pretty small number of countries compared to other countries in the world. So I believe that we continue to be a pretty open country, open to migration, that is, especially within the Latin American region. But circumstances have forced us to take certain action in order to seek a more secure, orderly, and regular migration as stated in the International Compact. At the national level, the most significant measure that was adopted yesterday is the process to regularize Venezuelan citizens. I would say that this is the most ambitious and largest regularization effort in Ecuador, because we're hoping to regularize about 100,000 people with pretty simple requirements. So basically passport, clean police record, and pay $50, which is a registration fee, in addition to granting immigration amnesty. That is to say, we're going to pardon all the migration fines to people that overstayed their visa. So it's an interesting process. It's not a silver bullet to the Venezuelan migration crisis, but we're making significant efforts, and we will assess the results hopefully in March when this process comes to an end. I would also like to say that Ecuador works not only at the national level, but at the regional and global levels as well. At the regional level, I would talk about the Quito process, or the Quito initiative that Ecuador led over the past year. Ecuador held 3 meetings in Quito aimed at coordinating regional policies to assess and seek solutions to the migration problem. So we have done a lot of work domestically and also at a regional and global level, because at the global level we participate in and promote parallel events in several fora. For example, the latest side event that we organized jointly with Peru, Colombia, and Canada in the fringes of the UN General Assembly. These are very interesting events because they enable us to disseminate the migration issue and especially foster donors to contribute with international cooperation to cover the needs that we have in the countries that receive the largest number of migrants. Finally, at the global level, we're presiding the Global Immigration and Development Forum, so we are working in pretty much all of the international areas to promote awareness of the issue, promote solutions and cooperation. Ecuador chairs this International Migration Forum, and we will have our summit in January, where we will continue to analyze this issue, including other non-state actors such as the academia, NGOs, international organizations, etc. So I believe we are making huge effort. And to conclude, I would like to say that we are also working with refugees. I want to remind you that Ecuador continues to be the Latin American country with the highest number of refugees. Historically, we have had 68,000, out of which 55,000 are active, and on a yearly basis, we add about 4,500 new refugees with recognized status. So we are working very hard on this. We have a lot of experience dealing with refugees, especially from Colombia, and actually the majority of our refugees are Colombian. And so these are basically the areas of work that we have been focusing in Ecuador. Thank you very much. Now, so Chile has also received large migration flows, not only from Venezuela, but from Haiti, Peru, and many other countries. There's been a turning point in Chile from being open to being a little bit more closed in. You just released a very good book that I recommend, Migration in Chile, Evidence, Myths, and a New Reality. It's a very complete book issued by the Jesuits University. It's a great book. It's in Spanish, but it is very academically sound. It goes chapter by chapter, going through immigration and health, immigration and education. It will be mandatory reading for all countries in the region, by the way. But I find it kind of odd that there's protests in Chile, but have nothing to do with migration. So on the one hand, they say that people have to close the borders a little bit more, but then there's this popular outcry that does not even refer to migration. So how do there's politics, but then there's the popular response to migration, and how is Chile changing in this regard? Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. To give you a little bit of background, in Chile, there's been in 5 years, the migration population has tripled. We went from 400,000 to 1.25 million. And the source countries have diversified. We used to have mostly from Peru and Argentina, and some from Bolivia, then Colombia, Haiti, and Venezuela. And at the same time, they started going to different parts of the country. Even though 60% of the population, migrant population, lives in Santiago and the metropolitan area, nowadays in every single community in Chile, we can say that there's been some migrant living there, based on data from the 2017 census. And going back to what Colombia was saying, Chile is a destination country. Now, just like a few years ago, migration was Peruvian, then there was Colombian, then there was Haitian, and now it's Venezuelan. I don't know how to say it in English, but in Spanish it's easy. So, in the case of Chile, Venezuela hasn't been the major issue, but rather Haiti. Even though more people have come from Venezuela, and even though since the beginning of President Piñera's administration we talk a lot about Venezuela, nowadays Venezuela they're suspicious that there's Venezuelan groups in our society, but people have not taken that against migration. Migration has been on the agenda over the past few years. In Chile, we have a new bill, which is the oldest in South America. It's from 1975, when our political context was completely different. So it's been on our agenda with a bill and a series of visas. As part of the visas that we have imposed, we added Venezuela, started in April last year. It's called the Democratic Responsibility Visa. It's basically a consular visa. You say, okay, you can come here, but you have to request this visa in Caracas or in Puerto Vaz, and started in June in Lima and in other consulate offices in Ecuador. What, in our opinion, the government has seen is that this phenomenon at the border, not in cities. In Chile, 7% of the population is migrant, but we don't have intersectoral processes to address migration in cities, but rather border controls. And what other countries do is that they see a dichotomy in reality. Borders are either open or closed. They either contribute or they don't contribute. They are Venezuelan or they are Chilean. And that's why in our book we asked 23 different authors to address it from all these different areas. And as part of this democratic responsibility visa, we started thinking whether that wouldn't be a way to, conceal a refuge, because I'm telling you to ask for an ID, which you can use to buy a cell phone or to go to a health center, but the rights of the people depend on this. And Chile, unlike Ecuador, the request for refuge is very low. In last year, we granted refuge to 125 Venezuelans. That's it, 125. We have a lot of data that you can find in Chile.cl, which contains all the migration data. So this democratic responsibility visa, which has been a way to address Venezuelan migration, has helped, because if you go to Chile, it takes 7 months for you to get this ID. But if you request a visa, you get it from day one, and you can come to our country with that ID. But we need a more insectoral processes about, assimilation. And then we also have to see the tourism visa. Peru gave a 3 weeks notice, Ecuador gave a 1 day notice, and Chile did it on the same day at the border, which has decreased inflows and an increase in non-official points of entry. And we have a lot of landmines in Chile, by the way. So in Chile, the discussion has focused on the Ministry of the Interior, which deals with migration. But each country in the region has seen what kind of solution to come up with to address the Venezuelan crisis, but without a consistent response. Because people do not live in a safe, orderly, and regular manner. They do it irregularly. People are willing to move around, and I have been speaking with some Venezuelans in Chile, and they say, well, if it's no longer Chile, where do we go? This was the destination country. So for the past week and a half, there's been a lot going on. There's been deaths, violation of human rights, all kinds of destruction and looting, which up until a month ago was unthinkable in Chile.
De fronteras. Not only having the borders be administrative in their management, but we also have to think of immigration as that has been a rejection of the Haitian population more than the Venezuelans. Thank you, Tomás. I think one of the issues that you were raising, and Christian also mentioned it as well, is that all countries have the right to control their borders, and everybody seeks to facilitate and control their borders. But now that you have this forced flow, the question is, do you just impose controls, or do you control migration through the unofficial ports of entry? So you have to seek that balance in the entire hemisphere. And I think every country is debating this issue. How do you seek that balance of controlling the borders? And obviously they have the right to do this, but also to dissuade the human trafficking or human smuggling of the migrants. And Argentina and Mexico have faced different realities because they're farther away from Venezuela, but Mexico has been known for the role it plays in asylum for these migrant flows. And generally, Andrés, I think it's worth noting that Mexico has led in the asylum status, and do you think the system is overloaded, or what would you say about that? Or would you say that Mexico has a very different approach to it, even vis-a-vis the United States? You have the highest levels, and in case of the Venezuelans, are you looking at Venezuela to be part of the asylum seekers as under the Cartagena Declaration? How is asylum approached vis-a-vis the Venezuelans? And how does it apply in the migration policies of Mexico? First of all, thank you so much for this invitation and for the question. I do think that it is important to take into account that in Mexico's case, Venezuela is an issue that's more linked to refuge or asylum more than migration. We do have these migrant flows into Mexico, which is tens of thousands of Venezuelans, but it pales in comparison to the migrant flows that we see from other countries, especially those that come from Central America into Mexico. Generally, in Mexico, in terms of the migrant flows that we see, we would have more than 70 nations that try, or nationalities that try to cross through Mexico, which has traditionally been an origin and destination country and a country of return as well. But especially now, more than today, we see that Mexico has become a destination country that not only affects or has Venezuelans coming in, but over 70 nationalities have sought refuge in Mexico. I'm the person in charge of COMAR, of the Commission of Refugees. So specifically referring to Venezuelans, I must mention that since 2016, we've seen an increase of Venezuelans into our country, of course, in smaller numbers than we see in South America, because we're talking about Venezuelans who are middle class, they arrive by flight, and they are perhaps in fewer numbers, and these numbers increased in 2017. Together with the Hondurans, they became the two nationalities that requested refuge or asylum more than any other nation. In the past few years, we can say that we've had more than 17,000 Venezuelans seeking refuge in our country, and up until October 25th of this year, we've had 6,392 Venezuelans seeking refuge in our country. And Andrew's question is very important because in Mexico, our legislation includes the Cartagena Declaration. It's taken into account, and normally, globally speaking, when we talk about a refuge, we talk about the 1951, and it's the 67th protocol, which is a more restrictive view of refugees' status, especially when we're talking about persecution. In Cartagena, in 1984, within the framework of the crisis we saw in the Americas, we had the Cartagena Declaration, which was a non-binding regional agreement, and yet Mexico includes that declaration within its policies regarding refugee status. So within that law, we have that broader definition, which is in the Article 13 of our law regarding refugee status. And we have also the Cartagena Declaration taken into account into this law. The new government started in December 1st when I started assuming the duties of the COMAR, and just up until then, we would see this application of the second of the Cartagena Declaration. And nowadays, I have been responsible for broadening the application of this definition to Salvadorans and Hondurans, but we will continue to and still apply the second definition of the Cartagena Declaration to Venezuelans. What is a Cartagena Declaration regard to? It's not just an individual persecution, but it also applies to people who, because of general violence or a violation of human rights or public disarray, that they've felt forced to flee their countries. So it's a broader definition that we're trying to apply to Venezuelans. And once again, we have seen an increase in this population in our country. Regarding Venezuelans, we have a 100% of Venezuelans who have been recognized who have sought refuge in our country. And this obviously is somewhat risky because we are actually reviewing this because it's not good for any country, and it's nothing that you see elsewhere that you have 100% rate of people applying as refugees. So something's off here. So we are obviously going to try to help the Venezuelans, and we're talking about a very complicated situation because it has to do with health care, food, and the basic access to basic services in our country. And obviously, this is something that we have seen in our country, that we have seen that Venezuelans have been recognized as such. We are trying to have getting a lot of training with the UNCHR, and we're trying to strengthen our asylum system. As Andrew pointed out, we are facing a situation in which have a very weak and precarious system in place right now. We're trying to do the work of sensitizing and having a better budget so that we can address these needs in a much more efficient manner. Mexico, Andrés, also has this complementary approach. So you can also provide asylum, but you can also provide protection to those who perhaps do not meet the requirements for asylum, but they would be in danger if they had to be forced back to their country. So you have both statuses, right? Yes. Our law is the law of refugee and complementary protection, and this, for Venezuelans, basically, they are all granted the status of refugee. Nobody has pretty much complementary protection, for example, with other Central Americans, although now more and more we are seeing a higher rate of people coming from the Northern Triangle countries, especially from Honduras and El Salvador, being granted this status because we're also applying the Cartagena Declaration to them. Raisa, could you talk a little bit about Argentina? And because Argentina and Uruguay have laws in which the Mercosur visas are granted, which actually grants an easier access to work as it applies to Venezuelans and even other South American residents. Could you talk a little bit about Argentina and its situation? Well, with regards to Argentina, I can talk a little bit about that, but what for us would be the greatest challenge that we face in our region in terms of responding to the Venezuelan migration is, first, we have to talk about a response as an emergency versus a response on the long-term basis. For many of us at this point, this migration is not going to leave our country within the short or medium term, so we then have to approach this from a longer term or longer point of view. So this rationale comes from our history in Argentina. We are a national organization, but we also have a regional focus in our work, and we also carry out our work with regards to the migration populations, but we also worked with them for the past 30 years. We've been working with them for the past 30 years. We have 4.5% of our population is comprised of immigrants, so we have a long history of dealing with immigration, and our experience has been that to approach these mechanisms from a longer point of view to strengthen our institutions seem to have been the right path and the more effective solution, because even though today there might be Venezuelans, tomorrow there might be Haitians arrive in our country, and it could be Brazilians, it could be Chileans. So we have to strengthen our institutions, and that seems to be a priority. And what we in Argentina have been able to work on the past few years has been the residency status through Mercosur. This is something that has been working in Argentina, not just for Venezuelans, but for others. But we realize that we have to strengthen the regional presence and do that in different levels. So in Argentina, when they decided to extend the Mercosur visa and grant that to the Venezuelans, so we have residency and we have visas in our countries, which we have a difference in between the two. But for us, it was a positive approach because that also provides integration for other nationalities coming into our country. So I think that is an important mechanism that other countries should take into account to be able to have a response that not coming or born out of an emergency, but rather that it gives a more long-term approach. We are two organizations that started to think what could be the different institutional mechanisms that could be more effective to strengthen the regularization processes that apply towards the Venezuelans, for example, and that could also have an overall impact on the institutions of our country. And within these different organizations we have from Peru, Chile, Ecuador, Argentina, Brazil, and others, and Uruguay, is that the solution with regards to the Mercosur agreement visa, that could be an option to be able to have this other approach, which is how do you approach the challenge of Venezuelan migration that would provide a more permanent solution to or approach to this challenge. And I think this would be interesting because on the one side, institutionality and strengthening the institutions is something that we've been focusing on for the past 15 years. We have been discussing this within things that already exist within the Mercosur agreement, and we've been able to include Colombia, Ecuador, and Chile. They have also taken into account this approach within their laws, and either they're in multilateral agreements or they're already incorporated into the law. So part of the work has already been done, but we still have to continue and strengthen our approaches. The national document and the passport could be the different entry documents used. And there are other requirements for residency under the Mercosur agreements could also already be taken into account. So there's a minimum approach that could be taken into account in order to have progress in this area. A third reason to undergo or accept this path would be to have public opinion in our favor, because residency under the Mercosur for many of the countries who are in Central and South America is the path through which migration is carried out. So if we have like countries of origin like Peru and Ecuador and Colombia for a long time, even Argentina and Brazil, many of our nationals are able to go through the regularization process through the Mercosur agreement. And this, if we have favorable public opinion, is something that could benefit all. That is one option. Another option could be humanitarian residency, which is linked to this complementary protection. So that is also obtained through the law. We have that already in Brazil, Argentina, Peru. They've already taken that into account into their laws. So I think this is another option that, although in Argentina it's not applied for Venezuelans, it is applied for Haitians, for Senegalese, and for Dominicans. So a little bit of our regional experience has shown that by getting together as organizations, we are able to come up with obstacles and best practices that will help other countries to determine options that would allow us to take this next step. And I think Mercosur and humanitarian residency could be one of the solutions to approach this challenge. Thank you so much. Excellent. I think one of the things that we want to really point out here is that even though in some countries asylum, like, for example, in Mexico, is something very clearly stated. In other countries, the response has been quite different, as opposed to what we've seen in other parts of the world. And whether you're a refugee or a migrant, these are flows, these are mass migration flows that are very diverse. It's very difficult sometimes to determine who is a migrant, who is a refugee, and sometimes the solution that has been more effective have been massive solutions, if you will, mass solutions. So say we have the PTP in Peru, or the Democratic Responsibility Visa in Colombia, and what we have in Ecuador, or the Mercosur visa, simply stated, is because of who you are coming out of your country or to become a citizen of a country that's part of the Mercosur agreement. I know right now there's countries who are out of the Mercosur agreement for now, but you could be granted a stay for this country. For example, in Peru, you could be provided a visa, so then you can request residency. These are all protectionary measures. So we also have to take into account these stays, permits, and visas and other protectionary measures that could be taken into account in Latin Americans and how we approach this. So this is part of our debate today. Roxana and Christian, could you talk a little bit more, and Hernán as well? You who are basically in the eye of the hurricane, what do you need from the international partners? For example, in Syria and Rohingya, we've saw a very broad approach and focus towards the world, but we haven't seen this in Latin America, not at least with that approach. What do you want from international cooperation? What would you like to see in your region? Thank you. I think basically we have been working in agreement with Colombia. Peru is not a border country with Venezuela, and yet we are the second country with the largest Venezuelan population. This basically is due to the fact of the protectionary measures that were passed in Peru in order to provide a regularization process for the Venezuelans in Peru. And I think this is also work that we've been carrying out with Colombia. Thank you. Thanks to the PTP. And a hi to Christian, and congratulations on your birthday. On the other hand, I think one of the greatest challenges that we have faced is how do you integrate these members of the Venezuelan society into Peruvian society in a way that's orderly and safe, and that it's also productive. This is probably one of the greatest challenges that we face in Peru. All of this basically is summed up in the fact that we do need the help of the international cooperation. Peru has not necessarily required it yet, but we have been assuming, just like other countries, we have been taking on these people for them to be productive and to be able to be part of our society. They need help. All these people, sometimes they come to our countries and they don't come in the best conditions. We have 30% of the latest migration population are minors, children who come sick with even infectious diseases and malnourished. So as a country, we've been working on vaccines, on providing health care to these children. So this obviously costs a lot of money, millions of dollars, especially when we have to use it to help the Venezuelan populations arriving in our country. So we don't have all the answers, but for us, this has become an emergency for us. It's a pressing matter for us. We understand that Syria and other countries have their own problems. And this is obviously the world focus has been on them. But in Latin America, the region as a whole has been assuming the situation. And obviously, there's a lack of response to the degree which it is needed. So even though international cooperation organizations are present in Peru, their contribution is minimal. And this obviously does not allow us to fully provide that integration that we want of the Venezuelans into our society. And we do have politicians who, using or taking advantage of this need, are carrying out campaigns to try to change the mindset of this people of Peru who are in solidarity with the Venezuelans. And what they're stating is that Venezuelans are going to take their jobs away because they are a cheap and highly skilled labor force. And for us, that is probably one of the greatest challenges, because what that does is really it worsens the relationships, and that generates xenophobia, even though in Peru it's not as grave. I mean, Venezuelans are not under attack. And yet, we do think that people have to be sensitive towards this issue, and I think that's probably one of the most important things that we need in order to carry out our work. People have to be aware and sensitive to their needs, because sometimes this leads to a situation that could be very complicated in order to address migration. And we need the training, and we need to be creating these awareness campaigns, but we also need to have the budget to be able to address all this. We're not in a situation right now where we can request loans to address the situation. So we have been calling upon the international community to provide the necessary assistance that we need. And I do agree with everybody here and what they've been saying here, is that to impose more strict measures for entry, I think that lead to like a sub-registry, if you will, because then that generates and creates invisible people in our societies. Then we won't be able to know the kinds of policies that we need to address the needs of these people. And sometimes these amounts that are almost impossible to bear, then that will lead to the lack of assistance to the populations that need our help. And I think we need to create this special focus. And Colombia and Peru, who we both have received the largest amounts of migrants, we definitely need the assistance to address the situation. And what do you need from international cooperation? It's also worth noting that Venezuelans go to Guyana and Brazil. There's a Guyanese colleague who wasn't able to come today, but Colombia is still the leading country that has received Venezuelans in the greatest amounts. Thank you, Andrew. I have maybe 4 points that I would like to address very specifically as to how to approach migration in our countries, especially as to the needs that we see vis-a-vis the international community. I have 4 issues. One is the goodwill of the countries. There are countries who have no goodwill to perhaps be more flexible in this approach to migration. So I think, first of all, we need the goodwill. From the legal standpoint, I'm a lawyer, and there are probably a lot of lawyers here in this conference, but if you want things to progress, you need to resort to the law. You need a decree. You need the Constitution to protect that. So, first of all, we need the goodwill of the countries to address this approach. Second of all, we need to depoliticize this issue. We see a lot of movements in our countries. I'm not going to go into specifics, but we see, for example, Venezuela goes beyond that. We're talking about people who are dying of hunger. So we need to really set aside what is the political discourse and how we approach it, because every time there's a change in the government, every time that there are changes under any criteria, then you start politicizing this issue. And there's a reality that I don't think we have to say it as coming from Colombia. There are people who are dying of hunger. So I think we need to ask countries to depoliticize this issue. And obviously there are millions and millions of people whose rights are being violated on a daily basis. Obviously the dictatorship aims and wants to really have these people out of their country so they have fewer people to feed. But this humanitarian issue is an important issue. Thirdly, we need to bring together all the things that we've been talking about, the PTT, the PTP, and all the different visas. These have all been great issues. And it goes beyond a responsibility that it's not just Peru's responsibility, it's Argentina's, Colombia, Mexico, or any other country in the region. It's not our responsibility, but obviously we're talking about human beings who need our help more than ever. And if we don't understand that this is a regional phenomenon, and that if each country keeps applying these principles in an individual manner, then we're not going to have the positive results that we all seek. So I think we need to create this awareness within the group of Lima and the Quito process that whatever we agree to, we must apply. Because we always have to have that present. We have to know that this process, if we don't come into an agreement as to the same principles and rationale that we need to apply, we're not going to be able to address this issue. And then that's only going to result in one country receiving more migrants than others. And we have to have these specific measures. And with regards to the international community, I think we all share, this issue, and we're talking about money. The cost of health care is extremely high. It's a very complicated issue. Just to give you an idea, in 2015 in Colombia, we had 1,475 Venezuelans who needed emergency medical care. If not, they would have died. And last year, it was more than 132,000 Venezuelans who received health care costs. And now we're over 205,000 Venezuelans who've had to undergo emergency medical assistance. So obviously for every country, it's different. Everybody's assuming these high health care costs. And without the help of the international community, we couldn't do this. But obviously, as someone already pointed out, vis-a-vis these migration flows, not only within and outside of our countries, the international community has given help to other regions of the world more than in our region. So I think we need to request this international assistance, and that all countries must understand what we're going through. This is the second largest immigration phenomenon that we've seen in the world. And if these numbers continue to grow, we're going to be talking about being the first. So I think the international community needs to be made aware and understand the situation that Venezuela is going through, the amount of people who are fleeing and leaving their country. And many of you have already talked about it. Many are coming with, they need help. They have no money, not even to take the bus to go to their destination. Sometimes they even have to go on foot. So this is a community, this is a population that needs a lot of help, and we need to help these people, and hopefully we hope that we never have to be a country that undergoes this kind of situation. So we call upon the international community to provide more assistance, especially financial assistance, to be able to address this issue. So I think if we all help each other out, we're all going to win. And I think if we don't help now, we're not going to be able to sort this out. So it's great that all countries in the world, it would be great if all the countries in the world would have a quota in which they could receive Venezuelan refugees. I wish they could realize that if they all had passports, the Venezuelans, most of them, 90% of the Venezuelans don't have their passports. So they're forced to flee towards the south. But if people realized that with passport in hand that they could go to other countries in the world, I think that would be a positive thing. Because we must remember that Venezuela and these kinds of regimes, they depend on remittances. And we have to make sure that these remittances could actually, sometimes it's even more money that benefits some of the regions of our country. So that would allow us to receive them. So these are the four: goodwill, to harmonize our approaches to migration, and to request this financial assistance. And we haven't even talked about safety and security. And having a neighbor as Venezuela, in Colombia, and for the region, it's a very complicated issue. We have seen how countries have been affected. There are countries with regards to security that we have seen that by having a dictator as a neighbor, as Maduro, you've seen the impact that that has had. So those are the four elements that I wanted to mention. Thank you so much.
So we will move on to Q&As here in the room quickly. But Hernán, I would like to address the same issue and talk a little bit about social cohesion. What does Ecuador need from the international community, and more specifically the Latin American region? For example, for Ecuador, whose economy is going through a slowdown period, our growth is projected to be 0.2% this year, 0.4% next year. It's extremely hard to find resources to address the needs that stem from this crisis. Let us remember that the Ecuadorian Constitution provides for access to social security, education, and health to all migrants regarding regardless of their status.
Y obviamente esto nos está costando mucho dinero. Se calcula que el año pasado el Estado ecuatoriano gastó como $80 millones en atender esta crisis. Se calcula que en los próximos años serán promedios de 120, 150 millones de dólares al año. Evidentemente el Estado ecuatoriano no tiene ese dinero, entonces uno de los llamados que ha hecho Ecuador lo sigue haciendo y lo hace el día de hoy, incluso en la conferencia internacional de solidaridad que se realiza en Bruselas, es ese llamado a la responsabilidad compartida.
Brussels is to call for shared responsibility. This is not a national issue, a regional issue, but rather a global issue. So there has to be shared responsibility. We, the countries that are affected the most by this situation, are not financially in a position to address it on our own. We need more international cooperation. Now, what kind of international cooperation is the question I hear oftentimes? Well, more and more, we need cash. We need grants, non-refundable donations to have a productive focus in our projects and to be able to generate jobs. I know that many donors have technical cooperation better or humanitarian aid, and all that is very good, but the root cause of this issue will be addressed if we assimilate the population, and we're not going to do this with as food stamps or shelters, but rather by having productive development and assimilation projects. So that's the message that our foreign minister is conveying to them. I'm sure he already gave this message because of the time difference. So hopefully the international community will be sensitive to these issues and the huge amount of money that this is costing us. The UN platform to address the crisis has $738 million a year available to address the migration crisis. That is huge. Just for Ecuador, they're talking about $200 million. Now, how much of that is going to come from international community? Well, that's still a question mark. This year was about 20% of that amount. So we have a huge funding gap to address this issue. And hopefully the international community will be more sensitive, more generous, and more committed to this issue, just like there was a commitment with the issue in Syria, which, according to some estimates, received $5,000 per refugee. In Latin America, it doesn't even amount to $100 for each migrant from Venezuela. So that's what we expect, more solidarity, more commitment, more generosity. And honestly, I believe that each state that is being a host state is doing their share, but we're overwhelmed. That's the message. Thank you.
Les quiero preguntar.
Thank you, Hernán. Reisa and Juan Tomás, what is the social issue? And we have a colleague here that talks about social cohesion issues, and Catholic Union has also worked in this. Chile, Argentina, Brazil, you all have a history. Well, all of Latin America, by the way, has a history of migration. But in recent years, there's been less migration, with the exception of Costa Rica, which has, 10 to 20% of its population that is born abroad. But in the rest of Latin America, the figures have remained pretty low, and that is changing rapidly. So how do you handle social cohesion? What do you need to do in order for these societies to understand that they are host countries and that they perceive it as a benefit? I think there are two things. We need policies and we need narratives. In our book, there's a chapter that says that the net contribution by Venezuelan migrants in our country is $1 billion. And it hasn't affected the local labor market. So we need to do our research to provide the true figures. This does not mean that we need to look down on people that reject migration. I think that we need to account for that, because migrants get to the sectors of the population where the poorest of the poor tend to live. So we need territorial policies. We have seen that several countries have developed measures to migrants, and more specifically with Venezuelans. So they need measures or policies for the migrants, but also they need territorial policies, because otherwise there's more racism, more xenophobia. If I always benefit one sector over others, be it certain types of migrants versus others, or migrants versus locals, it will collapse. Even though protests in Chile have nothing to do with migration, they point to migration as the root cause. They said $1 billion goes straight to our tax authority. So why don't we highlight that? Also, we need to have governments involved. It's up to the incumbent government to decide how to sway things one way or another. So we need more consistency. Some regional countries have developed joint policies, but some other countries are on their own. And also, we need to have intersectoral process. So not just immigration status, but also housing, health, education, labor. All of these ministries need to be involved to address not only the needs of our migrants, but also the most vulnerable sectors of our local population. And there also has to be dialogue with the civil society. In Chile, at least, the government has come to a breaking point with civil society, and the civil society is closest to the migrants are to the people, to schools, businesses, neighborhoods. So in order to achieve social cohesion, we need to work jointly with civil society. So we need government policies in the region and also intersectoral coordination. We also need to work jointly with civil society and not focus in policies only on Venezuelans or only on Chileans or only on migrants, because that will necessarily cause social disruptions. They're going to say, why are they getting something where I have been here in this country working for 30 years and I don't get anything? I fully agree, and I had 3 things to say. The first one is what we talked about the first time around, which is to regularize migration as the key solution to regularize the migrant population. The second one is that I fully agree with what Roxana said in terms of government authorities having to stop linking migration to crime when that is not supported by research, and all it does is encourage social tension and xenophobia. And the third point is along the lines of what Jose Luis was saying, and also with what Hernán was saying, and that is when we have unequal societies like ours, international cooperation and governments focusing on a specific sector of the population also contributes to xenophobia. So it would be good to think about strengthening government institutions and social policies and show the population that the Venezuelan migration will help us all live better, not only in terms of how much the contribution contributes financially to our country, but also how it attracts development, for example. So if we're going to talk territorial programs, access to justice, for example, access to justice is for migrants and for the population in general. If we're talking about access to medicine, for example, international cooperation can help the entire population in the country to access drugs or medicines, because that contributes to trying to level the playing field and prevent tensions and that breakup between locals and migrants. So with these 3 items, I believe that we will be in a position to achieve social cohesion. And finally, before moving on to our Q&A, the asylum system in Mexico, even though it is highly functional and it's generous and it's a leader in the hemisphere in that sense, I have the feeling that it's overburdened. So what do you need in order for your system to continue to work effectively, both for Venezuelans and other types of migrants? Thank you, Andrew. I believe we need to understand that in Mexico, we do not focus on Venezuelans. Venezuelans are one of the many nationalities. Otherwise, actually, this year is the fourth largest population. The first one by far is Hondurans. We have about half of asylum seekers be Hondurans, followed by Salvadorans, followed by Cubans, which this year we're in a particular situation because of the huge financial crisis in Cuba. Fourth, Venezuelans, and fifth, Haitians, which is also a surprise, by the way, because of the social situation and the political situation in the Hispaniola island, which is part of Haiti. Fourth, Guatemala, which is part of the Northern Triangle, and then Nicaragua. All of these countries have, all in all, about 2,000 asylum requests in progress. For Honduras, we have about 30,000. This is just for this year. So honestly, Mexico, of course, is not in the same position as South American countries. I fully agree with different scenarios, and we will be very difficult to politicize our response to the Venezuelan migration. And actually, Mexico has a strict defense of the Cartagena Convention, and we have the highest level of acceptance of Venezuelan migrants. So it's not a financial request for the for the national community, because but rather we are thankful. Thanks to the UNHCR, our system has not collapsed, because otherwise we will be on the verge of collapsing. Our asylum seekers request, financial aid, legal aid, also national training. We have developed over 8 different national trainings with support from the UNHCR, and we have a system that's called the Quality Assurance Initiative, CAI, and that is officials hired by UNHCR that have some kind of government experience, because governments are more sensitive to understanding other governments more so than the UN. So these public officials are hired by UNHCR. They work within COMAR. We worked on our training, which helps a lot. So it's not so much a request, but rather I have a request to the government of Mexico, not so much to the international community, because Mexico as a destination country is a new phenomenon. So we need to understand at the government level how important this is in order to have the responsiveness necessary to address migrants' needs. So it's not just a matter of productivity, efficiency, and numbers, but also quality. That is to say, we cannot move forward with simplified or streamlined processes, which we're trying to do in order to be faster and more efficient, but to not make the quality of our eligibility decisions hurt at all. So I'd like to conclude by saying that it's very important to continue receiving support from the international community through the UNHCR, but also have government funds. Thank you, Andrés. And with that, we're going to move on to the Q&A.
From the audience, los que están aquí en la audiencia.
Those of you who are here in the room can do so by raising your hand, like when we were in school. And those that are connected via internet, you can send us the email to the address that I said before, or send a tweet to #MigrationPolicy, Migration Discuss, or a tweet to @MigrationPolicy, and we will start answering. There are way too many acronyms, right? We will begin here in the room. Please wait for your microphone.
This is a bilingual discussion, so feel free to do either.
I'm Ken Meyercourt. I got it.
Your name again, sir?
Ken Meyercourt.
Great. Do you have an affiliation or
retiree?
Happily retired.
Living the
great.
good life. I hope some of the younger ones will be able to do that someday as well. I got here a little late, so I don't know. Did anyone suggest as a solution to the immigration crisis removing the sanctions on Venezuela so living conditions could be improved there?
The sanctions? Let's take a round of questions and comments. A gentleman there, a woman over here.
Sí, muchas gracias. Sí, gracias.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. Juan Carlos Sanchez from the Embassy of Ecuador. Very interesting to hear all this point of view. The question is addressed to you. We, as an embassy, have a series of programs a list of programs that the U.S. government has been implementing with the Venezuelan migration. And in our opinion, they are not enough to supplement the efforts made by host countries. But maybe you, with your experience in Washington, can also supplement what the authorities have said in terms of what other cooperation options there are with the United States in order to work jointly in this issue, which is a priority for our countries. Thank you. I am not in a position to talk about on behalf of the U.S. government at all, but I'll try. Good morning, Sara Meneses. I'm Peruvian, and I have a question for all of you about what kind of best practices in terms of inclusion have you worked on or are you working on in your states? I understand that Argentina has good examples in the issue of health and integration in that sense, but I would like to know about the other countries. How are you working in these topics? Thank you. Would anyone like to begin? As far as I am concerned, let me see. We also, let me see if there's any other questions that we received via internet. I believe that their international cooperation response is still in its infancy. We're going to hear from some donors later today, and they can better speak about the position by the international community. But I believe that the response has been quite slow. We have to acknowledge that the United States government has been the most active in Europe, Brussels right now. There's a conference being held by the European Union to talk about the Venezuelan migration. Hopefully it will spark some interest on that side of the Atlantic Ocean, but compared to what we have seen in other migrant or refugee crises in the world, I would say that the government response is still very slow. And in part, it is because people stay in Latin America. The same happens with Nicaraguans and Costa Ricans. It is a crisis that is not affecting the U.S. and Europe or Japan or Australia, which are traditionally the major donor countries. But in part, I would say that the region has been a victim of its own success in the sense that we have not seen large refugee camps with the exception of some areas in Brazil. There's no large refugee camps. If you go to some countries, some people are on the streets, living on the streets, so there's some visible, but not to the extent that we have seen in other refugee crises. So to some extent, this crisis has been resolved or addressed by the host community. So they are in a position to respond, and we need to see to what extent and for how long. That's yet to be seen. But would anyone else like to answer?
I think that what you're asking about sanctions, I think it makes a lot of sense if the whole issue is related to a very complicated situation, economically speaking, and a humanitarian situation that is coming from the poverty that has been increasing and lack of food, lack of medicines and so on. I don't think sanctions help. I think that we will need to try to have a stronger response in every single area, but I don't think that sanctions, not only in Venezuela, it hasn't actually worked anywhere else. I mean, you have the example of Cuba, so many years, and if the intention of sanctions is to try to defeat the government, that's exactly it's not exactly working elsewhere.
Christian, tú podrías tener...
Christian, you may have a different opinion. Do you?
No sé si, bueno.
Okay, maybe not. Christian, I don't know if you heard the question, but the question is whether sanctions are part of the migration issue or part of the solution. Well, this is a pretty complicated issue. Sanctions on Venezuela or financial restrictions that are imposed on Venezuela are positive on the one hand, in the sense that they aim at preventing these people from continue growing and abusing millions and millions of people. But by the same token, these sanctions, unless they go hand in hand with other types of actions aimed at providing some kind of more definitive solution to the root cause for this migration problem, all they will do is force more people to leave the country. Financial restrictions that are imposed on countries obviously make a lot of people leave the country because they have no money to make a living. Minimal salary is under $3. There's no health infrastructure for people to remain in Venezuela. There's no schools. There's not even basic supplies such as, stationery. So sanctions are not a solution. We need to address the root cause and to have democracy reinstated in Venezuela. Venezuela needs to go back to being the country it used to be a while ago, economically speaking. And we're speaking as neighbors. Venezuela used to be a very attractive and appealing destination in the region, not only for Colombians, but for many other countries in the region as well. It used to be a country with the largest, and still is, largest oil reserves, a country that had a lot of services. It was an attractive destination for the countries in the region. So all these sanctions and financial restrictions, all they're doing is forcing more people out. We understand that they're trying to isolate the regime, but they need to go hand in hand with other measures that enable democracy to be reinstated in Venezuela. If we don't understand that the root cause for these migration flows is precisely that, then we will continue talking about humanitarian aid and ways of assimilating migrants in our countries. We understand migration as a positive phenomenon as long as it's handled in an orderly and safe manner, not only for migrants themselves, but also for the receiving communities. But we need to understand that the root cause has a very clear reason to exist, and that needs to be addressed. I agree with everything that has been said today. We have to go from humanitarian aid to assimilating these people to a productive population. We cannot stay at the humanitarian aid level only. Argentina is a very important example in terms of assimilating migrant populations, but again, we need to have a smart immigration policies. Chile also talked about understanding the receiving of the host countries. We need to not only address the needs of the migrants from Venezuela, but also the needs of these host countries, because unless we do it that way, there will be a lot of rejection, a lot of resentment towards migrants, which is not at all what we want. So everything we're doing in Colombia is along those lines. We want to merge these people from two different worlds. We need to join efforts also in addressing migration issues. It's different when there's only one country involved, but here the region as a whole is involved. So we need to develop joint policies to address the needs of this population. I would like to thank everybody. I know that we have been working hand in hand on several things on this regional mobility card and other things that we have working on in the Quito framework. Argentina has been a great partner in this regard, so has Peru. But I believe that we need to come up with urgent measures. Just in Colombia, again, we receive 2,000 Venezuelans a day. These are Venezuelans that come to our country to stay. These are not return migrants. These are not pendular migrants. These are people that move to our country to stay. So we need urgent measures to address this phenomenon in the most effective manner. And we need more support from the international community in order to address this phenomenon, because obviously there's a big migration component to this phenomenon, but there's other components that we as citizens of the world need to understand. The issue of security is very, very hard. Even though some countries are not suffering migration, some countries in Europe or overseas do not feel the impact of migration, and the figures that we have shared today should make us understand that in the world, having people like this, it poses a risk to security, not only in the region, but in the world. So for the international community, we want to tell you that there's a big risk in having a regime like the one in Venezuela, a dictatorship that in addition to affecting the human rights of these people, but the security, not only of the country, but of the region, and potentially other countries that are very far away from here. So this is a wake-up call. We need to work together. We need to understand that in addition to migration, there's other issues as well. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be part of this meeting. And I'm going to remind you that November 20th to the 22nd here in Colombia, we will be having the Ibero-American Network for Migration Authorities. So you are all invited to join us. We will be talking about a lot of issues, Venezuelan migration, trafficking in migrants, because a lot of countries are interested in this, technological advances. It will be a very interesting conference, and it will be done in Cúcuta. Cúcuta is a city on the border with Venezuela. So in addition to the theory that we talk about and the speeches and the remarks that we share, it will be very interesting for you to see what our context is like, what is happening in our border with Venezuela. So this RIAN, this Ibero-American Network, again, will be meeting in Cúcuta, November 20th through the 22nd. You're all invited. If you have any questions, if you have not received the invitation, we are here ready to share that information with you, and it will be a pleasure to have you here. And part of the expenses will be paid for by the International Migration Organization, so it will be a pleasure to have you here in Colombia, your country, for you to see with your own eyes and also to have technical discussions. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to promote this event, which is very interesting and very important for all of us. Like I said, the migration authorities will be there to talk about openly and honestly, and we can see what we can all do together to address this situation, and we'll talk about other things as well. Thank you so much, Christian, for joining us from Colombia. Jose Tomás, we have about 3 minutes to answer the question, so very brief, please.
With regards, we had a new bill that was presented. Something that was very positive was a project that was done with civil society organizations for them to propose projects with migrants. The government is kind of is very big, so it's easier for the civil societies to have a more direct approach. And it started in the big city, but I think the communities and the smaller towns are more important. We have a law which is we have an IM or an app for instant messaging where you can, it's called Migrap with 2 P's at the end, which people can put in their questions. Sorry, interpreter cannot hear. We have an application also, it's called Mi Casa es Tu Casa, My House is Your House. It's kind of like Welcome Refugees. Chilean families welcome the refugees, and you have to pay the families. We are there for 3 months. The families are there with the migrants. They give them not only a bedroom, but they have to share the house with the migrants. We have one called Migration and Schools. This is all on migration, on our migration page, and all. It's chile.cl. another free advertisement. It's not just important to work with the students, but we also have to work with the administrative staff and the teachers, because they are the ones who establish the policies. MyGrab and Mi Casa Su Casa and Migration in Schools. We also have a network of businesses. We have Walmarts to small bakeries. Small bakery chain in Chile that's part of these processes as to how to provide this approach to the refugees and the migrants and to make them part of our culture. In our country, we have seen an increase of women who have also entered the labor market, and we've never heard that women are stealing our jobs. We hear that migrants steal our jobs, but we never hear about women. What if we change that perspective and we see that we all share something in common instead of seeing our differences? So we talk of our programs, Mi Casa Su Casa, MyGrab, Migration in Schools, and also the different cities' involvements and the Chileans being involved in these processes. I think are all key, especially when we have these local policies. That's what also has helped. And one last thing, and I think the awareness programs includes Chileans. We all have to see each other as being equals and different. And also, I think using celebrities is also key. That also kind of creates this profile of who we are as a people. I would like to thank this group of panelists. Thank you so much. Of all you who came from so far away, which basically comprises everybody in this panel. We're going to be here a little bit longer if anybody wants to talk one-on-one with them. We are going to take a 10-minute pause, and at 10:30 we're going to start with the next issue and discussion, which is Costa Rica and the arrival of Nicaraguans into Costa Rica. And we will take a break for 10 minutes. There's coffee outside. There's juice and refreshments outside. Thank you so much. Yo estoy